Joining us now in the Element Wealth Studios, Christina Dent, founder and president of End It for Good. Christina, good to see you. Thanks for coming on Middays.
Thanks, Gerard. Always fun to be here.
All right, so you have recently authored an article concerning the fatherless homes problem, or fatherlessness in general, in the state of Mississippi. What's on your mind there?
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that we don't often think about related to incarceration, particularly. So our organization, End It for Good, works on how we approach drugs and addiction. And so when we think about kind of those downstream collateral consequences, that's something that I think we're good at thinking about in other areas, and I think we're not great often at thinking about it related to incarceration, that whether or not we think a person should be incarcerated, there is very real collateral damage that's going to come from that in the family structure of that person, and our communities will bear the weight of that, whether we want to or not.
All right, so I hear you, and I don't think there's any question that often folks that are being incarcerated are leaving a void there in the family structure. But how do you balance that with the need to incarcerate people, first to deter crime, and then secondly, often to take them off the streets because they potentially pose a risk? So are we talking about just nonviolent offenders here, or violent, or both?
Yeah, so we would say let's just start with sort of low-hanging fruit of what if we talked about, a drug possession charge or something like that? Somebody struggling with an addiction who may need help, certainly, but for whom a criminal justice time sitting in prison is not going to be the thing that helps them to recover from that addiction. So I saw this. I always think, stats are kind of hard to get your mind around. Stories are a little easier. I saw this happen a couple of years ago. I was in court at a sentencing hearing, and when you go to court, you go and you see all the sentencing hearings happen at the same time because they come one right after the other. So you see other people that you don't know getting sentenced while you're there for whoever it is you're there to be part of their hearing. And I saw this man came in, and he was facing this charge for a nonviolent drug offense. He had a clean record for 10 years. He did have a charge 10 years before that. And his defense attorney said, he was struggling with an addiction at the time, and that's what that charge was from. He's had 10 years with no criminal justice involvement. This is not something that he needs to be going to prison for. And the man's fiance came, and she spoke to the judge, and she said, please, he's a wonderful person. She was pregnant, due the next week with their first child. She said, please let him come home. We need him at home. He is a good man. I'm sitting there watching that and thinking, wow, I can see this whole family structure is just right on the table here. What are we going to do? And as, she walks back to her seat, and the judge hands down the sentence, 16 years in prison for him. And the man is crying, and she is crying. And I think that the weight of that, watching that happen, it wasn't the only nonviolent drug charge, before the judge that morning. And you see that's one court in one county, in one state, in one country. And you see this is happening. It is when you watch that happen, it's understandable why we have so many broken families related to incarceration, particularly in Mississippi, because we imprison more of our population than any other state in the country does. We now have the highest imprisonment rate. And I think you're right to say, well, don't some of those people need to be there because not everyone is safe to have out in the community? Absolutely. But can we rethink some of the things we're putting people in prison for and recognize we're not getting the kind of return on that we want to be, and there's better things that we could do that would not have left this woman to raise a child by herself and a child without a father in the home for their entire childhood.
Yeah. So what's the solution? And this is interesting because I know this does come up a lot. You just cited a statistic where we have the highest incarceration rate. Is that because of our laws, our justice system, or our parole policies and regulations, or is it because we just have a higher percentage of our population committing crime?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we have, for a long time, just used the criminal justice system to try to solve lots of different problems. And I think one of the things that we hear from law enforcement officers who come to End It for Good events is the frustration of being asked to solve problems that their profession is not equipped to solve. So they are not mental health providers, they are not addiction treatment specialists, and yet we have said, go out there and try to solve this problem of addiction by arresting people. And they arrest the same people over and over again, and they're frustrated by that. The community's frustrated because it's not fixing the problem. And so we end up having this high incarceration rate, and it's increasing. Unfortunately, it was decreasing for a number of years. It is increasing again. We have over 18,000 people in prison. 4,000 of those are nonviolent drug offenders. So that's a cost to Mississippi taxpayers. It's a huge cost to Mississippi families and communities, as a lot of these people are parents. If you look, the Department of Justice says half of people in prison have minor children. Half of those parents, so a fourth of the people in prison, were living with their children prior to their incarceration, and a fourth of those people in prison were the primary source of financial support for their children before they went to prison.
How do you square this, Christina, with law enforcement? In my experience, it seems like they just want to lock everybody up, that they feel like that folks, even for nonviolent drug offenses, getting them off the street, they feel like is effective in preventing or deterring possible violent crime related to that. They seem to want to lock everybody up, honestly. So how do you square that with them? What's your message?
Yeah, I think the thing that I hear most is we want to solve the problem.
Okay.
And we have believed for a long time that solving the problem means locking lots of people up,
okay,
that this will deter everybody from doing the bad things. We know that that's not the case anymore. Simply locking people up for longer and longer periods of time, particularly on something like substance use, which is not driven by a person's internal desire to be rebellious or go and be bad. If somebody is wanting to numb the way that they feel, particularly if they're addicted, it's because there are painful things in their life, maybe trauma from their childhood, or there's so many other things that are driving that. That arrest isn't going to fix that. And you see in other countries, other places, that they're addressing substance use in a way that actually matches what's causing it. So we've kind of focused on the drugs and we've criminalized everything around them and said this will solve the problem. And it hasn't solved the problem. We've got highest overdose rates, high incarceration rates, high addiction rates. We still have all the problems, plus a lot more problems. And so if we can step back from that and say, we're using the wrong tool for this, the criminal justice system, an arrest is the right tool. If you go steal something, yes, that's the right tool. You've taken something from someone else. But it's not the right tool for everything. And I think law enforcement would be the first to say that's true, that they see that. They are not the right tool for everything. And yet we have been asking them to be that tool for lots of things. And so that's the message that they have embraced. And I think it is our role as citizens to say we want a different result. And so we're going to use some different tools for some of these issues.
Yeah. And I know that's been talked about a lot. And even Commissioner Kane has come on and said, these drug addicts that are just being incarcerated just because they possess drugs in a nonviolent way, we're not really helping them when we lock them up in prison.
Yeah.
They go out and they're still doing it.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about. Okay, so somebody who's struggling with an addiction, they could be pulled over by an officer and they're in possession of, some drug they're not supposed to be, and they're arrested at 10 o'clock in the morning. They could have walked into a treatment center at 10:15 in the morning, and they would be considered a patient with a complex health crisis who needs medical care.
Okay.
The exact same thing is happening. You have somebody who's addicted to a drug, but 15 minutes of time, depending on who gets to them first, is the difference between an extremely traumatic criminal justice involvement and a life being destroyed versus we recognize you're someone who might need help. How can we help you overcome this addiction and give you medical care That is a problem I think we've got to face. This is the same person who needs the same things, and we have two radically different approaches.
We got a break right here, but if you can hang around when we come back, we'll talk about a recent report released by the state auditor concerning the cost of this incarceration. Well, really the cost of fatherlessness is really what the report addressed. We'll talk about that and then have you share with you some ideas of how to address this problem.
Sounds great.
We got Christina Dent, founder and president of End It for Good in the Element Well studio. Mississippi, here's a comment for you, Christina, on the C Spire text line. We'll get you to respond to. A man on probation just murdered a police officer in Greenville. Do the crime, expect to do the time. Too late to play the I have a family card. You know anything about that?
I don't, but I'm not saying at all that didn't happen. Absolutely, it happened. And it can happen, and yet that's not a reason to say then, we sort of fling all the way to the other side of the pendulum and say, okay, well, we just lock everybody up because that's a way that we can guarantee that never happens. There absolutely are those times where that happens, but that isn't a one-size-fits-all then to say because this could happen, because it did happen, then we can't do probation. We can't do those kinds of things. The cost on the other side is also very high. We have to live with both of those costs, and it is very challenging. It's challenging to know. It's challenging for judges to know what do I do in this situation. I think it's a little bit easier to make that decision when you're talking about a drug possession charge where there hasn't been any violent acts in the past and things like that.
Yeah, I think it has to be an informed decision.
Right, yes.
Here. And in that particular case, honestly, I don't know the details. Rhino may know more about this than I do. But maybe the mistake here was that this person was potentially a risk of committing some sort of act of violence and should not have been granted probation.
Right.
So I think it's case-by-case basis. I think it has to be. If someone has got a propensity to engage in violence and they've got a history of doing that, even at a very small level, that needs to be considered. But if all they've ever done in the case, which is, I think, what End It for Good advocates for, and if I'm misspeaking, please let me know. If you've not committed any sort of act of violence and don't have any violence in your history on your resume, and all you've done in many cases, in the case of the situation that you wrote about in the op-ed, right? That was just a possession situation. Is that correct?
I think his first charge was, and then this one was we think he had something he was going to use to make into something, and
Okay, so that's just seems to me like that's got to be considered differently.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes total sense. I'm still intrigued by why we have this high rate of incarceration. Are our laws just stricter, especially when it comes to drug crimes, since we have such a high percentage of our incarcerated population in for drug crimes? Is it because our laws are stricter than other states? Is that what puts us at the top of the list?
We do have strict laws, and we also have a culture that embraces strict laws. A lot of our sort of the political rhetoric and what people want to hear is that. And so even when you have judges who are running nonpartisan, but this is what they're hearing from people, if you don't give someone a harsh sentence, you might pay for that in your next election. So I think some of it comes back certainly on us as citizens for what are we communicating to our leaders, to our law enforcement, to our judges, to our prosecutors about what we want to see. Are we communicating that we want to see good outcomes, that we want to see less crime? Or are we communicating that we don't really, that's sort of secondary? We just want to see tough. And we're not really kind of worried about that downstream impact or whether it's really having the impact that we want it to, whether that's on drug use, whether it's on violent crime. I think you could make a case that if we want violent crime to be solved, that we are using lots of resources finding, arresting, prosecuting, and incarcerating people who are not involved in violent crime. They're involved in drug possession. there are not unlimited resources. And so when we have, statistics, for years it has been that less than 50% or hovering right around 50% of violent crime ever has an arrest made in it. Now, that's not because we don't have officers who are out there doing their best, but there is only so many resources to go around, and we have chosen to divert lots of those resources into policing drugs. And we have lots of violent crime that is unsolved, and I think we could channel more of our resources towards that and use the resources we have in addiction treatment to address people's drug use and addiction.
Yeah, so on the C Spire text line, most drug addicts aren't interested in being a parent. Your thoughts about that?
So I have thoughts about that. I have met so many since I started this work. I got interested in this work as a foster parent who was the foster mom of a child whose mom was an addict for many years. And I say that term only to use the term that they're using in the text line. I don't prefer that term. I think it's kind of holds people into an identity, but someone who's struggling with an addiction. And what I saw in her, what sparked this desire for me to invite more people to rethink what we're doing, is seeing in her that she absolutely loved her son. Mm-hmm. She absolutely wanted to be there for him. And she also absolutely was struggling with a drug addiction. And so from the outside, you see behavior that says, wait a second, she doesn't care. She's using drugs while she's pregnant. And yet the more that I got to know her, the more I saw, no, there is a war going on inside of her between this addiction that's really strong and also this desire to be there for her child that's really strong. So do some people not have an interest in parenting? Yes, that's true of everyone, not just people who are addicted to drugs. Right. There's lots of people who don't want to be there for their kids. And yet there are also lots of people who do want to be there for their kids and desperately want to be free from that addiction or struggling through all sorts of experiences and feelings around that. And how could we help them better be able to be there for their kids, for the people who want to be? Isn't that the goal? Isn't the goal that we want more parents to be there raising their own children? We have, like you were talking about in the state auditor's report, they reported that about 250,000 Mississippi children have a parent or are living in a fatherless home. So that is a lot of children living in fatherless homes. And I think I want us to just begin thinking about the causes of that. And it is devastatingly sad that that's happening. And so if we want more children in fathered homes, we have to be addressing the causes of that fatherlessness instead of just saying they shouldn't have done it, they should get, whatever, they just should make better decisions. Okay, absolutely, people should make better decisions. But if our response to someone's decision actually makes it harder for them to be a father, I think that we can just say that we're not getting what we want from that. We're not having healthier families and communities.
Yeah, the last time I checked, we have the highest rate of fatherless homes in the country. And we were either one or two with respect to births out of wedlock as mm-hmm. well. So, mm-hmm. I mean, these are cultural problems that really are a burden on the entire state, because it's really difficult to have positive outcomes when you have those situations, talking about as a child is raised.
Yeah. And they highlight, too, in that report, the number of men who are incarcerated who grew up likely in a fatherless home. And that's where I feel like for us to develop an imagination around seeing that cycle play out mm-hmm. of, we know that for children who have an incarcerated parent, they're more likely to become incarcerated themselves. We know outcomes are not as good for children who grow up in fatherless homes, no matter where their father is. There are all of these things play in together. They're all sort of this domino effect that happens in the lives of many children.
Makes
and
sense.
we can stop some of those dominoes from falling by rethinking some of the reasons that fathers are being removed from their homes.
Yeah. So, what do you want to see happen? I mean, I know you've been involved with this for a while. You've been a strong advocate for reform here. What do you want to see happen?
I would love to see, first of all, for us to get curious about the reasons why are so many children fatherless, instead of just sort of saying, well, they shouldn't be, or, well, they're deadbeat dads, or whatever. Why? Let's get curious about that. Then start to think about what are some of the things that we might be proactively doing that are causing that, and can we look at other solutions for it? So drug possession. Is there a different solution for people using drugs that would work better than just putting people in jail? We know that's not a deterrent for people. For most people using drugs, states that have really strict drug laws don't have less drug use than other states do. So can we start treating drug use and addiction as a complex health crisis, like it is, and stop treating it as a criminal justice matter that is increasing harm to lots of people, but especially to the children of people who are incarcerated because of that?
You going to spend some time down at the Capitol this coming session to talk to members of the legislature about this?
We are always trying to educate, trying to help people rethink, and absolutely, our leaders are top of that list.
I'm sure we'll talk to you some more about those efforts. Christina, Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Gerard.
Christina Dent, founder and president of End It for Good, has been our guest on Middays. We got half an hour left in the program. Got some news about some towns in California, what they're doing with respect to gas stations. Stay with us.